I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Brent Barnett, and this is Unlocking Potential, a content partnership with Advance Agrilytics. And this month, the team at Advanced Agrilytics will be providing growers some insight around what the mid-season considerations are for different growing stages of corn across the Corn Belt. Joining us this month is Dan Emmert, lead agronomist with Advanced Agrilytics. Dan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brent. How are you doing?
We're doing well. It's been a nice month of July so far. And as we get started, Dan, you might share with the listeners more about your territory and how the crops are progressing so far this season in your areas that you cover.
Yeah, so I live in Southwest Indiana, kind of between Vincennes and Washington. And in my role as lead agronomist, I work directly with a handful of growers kind of in that Southwest Indiana area. And then I also get to support our great team of agronomists across Southern Indiana and Kentucky.
Are we seeing tar spot present in your areas, Dan? What's that looking like?
Tar spot has really ramped up between US 50 and I-70 during that week of July 15th. Fields that had previously been checked and were just a little bit of gray leaf spot. We had those rainstorms come through and several days with rain, and that really got the tar spot ramped up, and it's not very hard to find stroma throughout some of that late April planted corn.
Since we're looking at a wide variety of planting dates across the Corn Belt, Dan, what is the Advanced Agrilytics team coaching their growers to look for, depending on planting timing?
Yeah, and so if we think about this spring, there were several different planting windows from late April, late May, and even into June. And so as we think about where we stand today, if we have that late April corn that is really getting into that dough stage, management wise, there's not a whole lot that we can do. We still want to be out in those fields, though, and think about the mechanisms that are going on for nutrient uptake and building yield and the landscape, and really observing and seeing how all those management decisions that we've made, whether it was last fall, this spring, or this season, have impacted the crop progress and how it stands, and start getting a leg up and planning for next year. As we move into the corn that was planted in late May and June, we're just starting to get into the pollination window there. And so we are actively looking for disease pressure and noticing differences across landscape, as we think about needing 7 hours of leaf wetness for tar spot. There's definite differences in canopy closure and how long it's staying wet, and knowing where that pressure is going to develop at. So thinking through that, thinking through fungicide timing and hybrid management, and how that's going to impact the sucrose reserves in that stalk. That's another thing that we're noticing as we look into the lower portions of that stalk, is if we've had stress and haven't had good opportunity to create high levels of sucrose in that plant and are burning that up in nighttime respiration, we're not going into pollination with great reserves. And so thinking forward to next year, how can we manage differently to increase that? And also, do we need to adjust our fungicide timing to help increase those stores, as Jeremy Hogan talked about in our last segment? So those are some of the things that we're thinking about as we move from that early planting into that later May and June planting.
Let's talk more about management practices, especially considering these variable planting windows that we saw. Anything top of mind when it comes to that on the management side?
Really, the big thing, with these later plantings, we wanted to encourage rapid growth and get out and manage that crop and get our nitrogen applied and everything else soon to get it into the plant and really spur that development. And so now it's looking at that and monitoring. There are some fields where we're going to have to pull the trigger a little bit earlier than we wanted to on fungicide, and may have to come back in with a follow-up application. There are some areas across the Corn Belt, not as much in Southwest or Southern Indiana, Kentucky, where we had to make some rescue nitrogen applications. And looking at our proprietary in-loss layers and some aerial imagery, we can see there's zones where we're short on N and need to come in and get that nitrogen applied as quickly as we could so that we weren't limiting plant growth and ear size potential.
When it comes to nitrogen loss and where you're seeing it, what effect is that nitrogen loss having on the crop?
So really, it's kind of twofold. One, the conditions that cause nitrogen loss also limited root growth, but then running out of N as well, that is just a big component of crop growth, protein, chlorophyll, and photosynthesis. So overall, where we were running short, we've got a smaller canopy, collecting less sunlight, and putting less of that into reserve. And so it's kind of a vicious cycle where we're building a smaller plant. We're not putting as much into storage and just kind of falling further and further behind. And so we've seen where applying this later in, even though we can't go back and build a bigger plant, it can help us hold on to those kernels and increase our kernel size a little bit as we go through grain fill.
Do you have any examples to share of anything you've been seeing for your in-season observations so far when you've been out in the fields?
Yeah, so, at Advanced Agrilytics, we really pride ourselves on isolating the mechanism and the environment within a field and knowing that not every acre is exactly the same. And so one of the things that we've seen, Brent, is that where we can look at potassium level of a soil with a similar moisture regime, where we have adequate fertility in the soil and are able to get that into the plant, we're seeing a lower incidence of disease pressure. So that plant is able to wall off and defend itself from that disease better, fewer and smaller lesions than similar areas of the field with low potassium fertility. And in those areas, we're seeing bigger and more lesions. So that would be one example of some of the observations our team has seen. Another that we've seen is just the impact that phosphorus had on early growth, canopy closure, stalk diameter, and just the overall health of that plant as it's moving through the rest of the season.
We're talking with Dan Emmert with Advance Agrilytics here on Brownfield. For the rest of the 2024 growing season here, Dan, what should growers be considering? What should be top of mind right now?
Well, I think really the top of everybody's mind is markets and budget. And so the big thing is, as we evaluate any future input decisions, is what's the return that we're going to get on that? And rather than making a knee-jerk reaction to say, I'm done, I'm not spending anything else, it may be that a fungicide application and stopping tar spot, spending 3% of that total crop budget may help protect a greater than 3% of our total crop return. So I think that's the big thing that's on everybody's mind, is evaluating where's the best place to spend my dollars and is it needed or not. And so, that's just one of the things as we're out in the field that we try and help our growers walk through.
As we wind down this month's program, do you have any final thoughts on, things that growers should be keeping an eye on that could impact decision-making for the next growing season?
I would say just continue to be out in your fields and looking at things. In a lot of cases, we can see the effects of the decisions that were made on planting, whether it was a good day to plant or a bad day to plant, and how that's impacting root development, sucrose stores, and crop size. And documenting those decisions, documenting what's happened there, and having a way to come back and revisit that at the end of the season to see what the impact of those choices were. So I guess record keeping and keeping track of how that crop's developed and revisiting that at the end of the year as in a type of audit to really put a number around what those decisions have cost.
Great information as always, Dan. Thanks for coming on this month's program.
Thanks, Brent.
Agronomic expertise, cutting-edge research, unbiased recommendations. read the latest agronomic blog at advancedagrilytics.com. I'm Brent Barnett with Brownfield Ag News.